Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a story that, well, it just sent massive shockwaves through the financial world. We're talking about the final unraveling chapters of Bernie Madoff's colossal Ponzi scheme.
Yeah, and we're not just, skimming the surface here or rehashing the broad strokes that maybe you already know.
Exactly. We're going to get into the really granular detail, walking you through the specific moments of its collapse, the confession itself, the immediate and frankly brutal fallout, the long shadow of consequences, and then his eventual life and death behind bars.
And our guide for this deep dive comes from these excerpts from a work that takes a really specific look at the end of this story. Its title, in translation, something along the lines of Bernie Madoff, Deception, Dollars, and Destiny.
Right.
And these sections, they really focus in on the concluding events, giving us almost a scene-by-scene account of his final days of freedom and then, the subsequent years.
So our mission here in this deep dive is really to unpack these specific moments and details directly from these sources. We want to understand the precise sequence as it's laid out here, like what exactly happened, when did it happen, who was involved, and what was the immediate impact.
Yeah, we're going to try and extract those key turning points, maybe some surprising facts that jump out, and hopefully pull out the stark lessons that are embedded in this narrative, at least as presented by this source.
It is a story weighted, immense gravity and a tragic human cost. And the source material, it doesn't really shy away from that aspect at all.
No, it doesn't. So we'll approach it with the seriousness it demands, definitely. But our goal is to guide you through it, scene by scene, really trying to understand the mechanics of the collapse and also the human element caught within it as this specific account presents it. So yeah, let's unpack this final act.
Let's do it. Okay, so we're picking up the story at a point where, as the source describes it, the web begins to tighten. This part draws from a section titled, essentially, The Web of Lies Tightens.
That's right. And the source, it immediately takes us to a specific moment, presented as Scene 13. The year is 2008, a year etched into history for, well, lots of reasons. But for Madoff, it was clearly the beginning of the end. The global financial crisis has hit.
Hard.
Yeah, hard. And its ripples are crashing onto his shores, so to speak.
And the immediate, absolutely devastating impact. The source tells us that investors are demanding their money back. And we're not talking a trickle here in the context of a market panic. This would have been a flood, right?
Oh, absolutely. A flood. People needed liquidity. They needed their cash, maybe for margin calls, maybe just out of fear. And they were turning to Madoff, fully expecting him to provide it. After all, he was the steady hand, the guaranteed return guy.
Exactly. And the source gives us this really specific glimpse into Bernie's state of mind at that moment, described as being in his office. It says he's deeply distressed, troubled. Parisian is the word used. Apparently, this wasn't just, typical business stress.
No, this sounds like the stress of a man whose incredibly elaborate facade was just crumbling because the foundation, the constant inflow of new money was drying up fast. At the same time, the demands for the original, fake principal were skyrocketing.
And the source even offers what's presented as his internal thought, really capturing the raw panic of that precise moment. It quotes him thinking, basically, how can I return the money to so many people? I have nothing.
Wow.
That phrase, I have nothing, it's just incredibly powerful, coming from the man who supposedly managed tens of billions of dollars.
That internal thought is absolutely critical, isn't it? It's presented as a direct admission of the fundamental fatal flaw of any Ponzi scheme. When the music stops, when that new money inflow required to pay off earlier investors dries up.
Especially during a crisis when everyone wants their money out.
Precisely. There's no legitimate business activity generating profits. There are no real assets to sell off. His supposed billions, they just didn't exist. The source presents this thought as the ultimate internal confirmation of the absolute void at the center of his empire.
Yeah, it makes that connection between the broader systemic chaos of the 2008 crisis and the exposure of this massive individual fraud so incredibly clear. I mean, legitimate firms were in serious trouble too, yes, but many had real assets they could potentially leverage or sell, even at a loss. Madoff had, air.
Confidence, smoke and mirrors.
Yeah, exactly. And the crisis just wiped out that confidence almost overnight. Investor panic, it acts like a massive stress test, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And Madoff's scheme failed spectacularly because it was absolutely nothing real there to test.
And that specific phrasing the source uses, "I have nothing," it feels like it suggests more than just a lack of funds, right? It speaks to the total moral and operational bankruptcy of the entire enterprise. Was
Yeah.
it, a moment of genuine internal collapse for him, a final realization of the inevitability he had perhaps suppressed for decades?
Could be.
The source presents it as a moment of pure, expressed desperation born from the sheer inability to meet the demands that were now just raining down on him.
Absolutely. It really highlights how systemic risk doesn't just create challenges for everyone. It can specifically sniff out and dismantle frauds that are built entirely on public trust and momentum. When everyone suddenly needs their money for unforeseen circumstances, those promises of future returns or steady growth based on non-existent assets, they just don't hold up. They can't.
So, moving from that intensely internal moment of crisis, the source then takes us to scene 14. This is where it describes Madoff admitting defeat, but not to the world yet, but to someone deeply embedded in his operation, his trusted assistant, Frank DiPascali.
Ah, Di Pascali. Yeah, he was widely reported to be significantly involved, wasn't he? Particularly on the fraudulent side of the business, the investment advisory part.
Exactly. He was often described as the point person for the fabricated trades and statements on the infamous 17th floor.
So this moment feels incredibly significant. Madoff is turning to the person who was, in many ways, the operational heart of the deception itself. And the source quotes Bernie's words to Frank directly. "Frank, we can't do anything now. Everything is finished."
Wow. Just blunt.
Totally blunt. It's a stark declaration of surrender, not to the authorities yet, but to the internal reality of the scheme's collapse. He's telling his right-hand man, it's over.
And the source notes Frank's reaction. He's also described as being in shock, which is, well, it's fascinating, isn't it?
It is. If T. Pascali was indeed as aware or involved as later reports suggested, was his shock at the finality of it, like hearing Madoff actually say the words out loud,
Right.
or maybe the bluntness of the admission.
Or could it suggest a level of denial? Or perhaps even, and this is speculation based on the source describing his shock, perhaps even a lack of full knowledge about the true emptiness of the accounts until that very moment. Maybe he knew it was a fraud, but didn't grasp the sheer scale of the nothingness.
That's possible, too.
The source leaves the nature of Frank's shock kind of open to interpretation, but its presence, the fact it mentions he was shocked, really underscores the gravity of Madoff's statement to him.
It's like the architect telling his chief builder that the entire massive structure they've been working on for years, this elaborate glittering facade, is literally moments away from total, irrecoverable collapse, and there's not a single real beam left to hold it up.
Yeah.
This admission to Di Pascali, as the source presents it, marks the internal, operational end of the lie. The people running it, at the very core, knew it was over.
And this internal collapse, this admission, then leads directly into scene 15, which the source uses to starkly illustrate the immediate financial reality Madoff was facing. It contrasts his supposed past wealth, the billions under management, with his actual current situation.
Right, the source states that where he previously had billions of dollars associated with his name and firm.
Or at least that's what everyone thought.
Exactly what everyone thought. His personal bank account now only contained, according to the source, a few $1,000,000.
That difference is just... It's designed to shock, isn't it? From managing or claiming to manage tens of billions to having just a few $1,000,000 actually accessible in his personal accounts at that point. It showcases the vast, unbelievable gulf between the fabricated wealth and the actual funds available at that critical moment of crisis.
Absolutely. And the source describes his actions at this point as truly desperate. He starts trying to get money from his old friends and family.
Think about that for a second. This is the man who was seen as a titan of finance, the ultimate insider, a provider of immense steady wealth to others. Now reduced, according to the source, to basically begging for funds from his personal network.
It paints a picture of absolute sheer desperation. What was he even trying to do? Was he trying to scrape together enough funds to maybe make a few key investors whole? Just to buy a little more time, maybe fund an escape plan?
The source doesn't really specify the motivation behind this outreach, but the act itself is incredibly telling. It shows the game was truly up. And the outcome, according to the source, is equally stark. Nobody helps him.
Nobody helps him.
Right.
Just wow.
That phrase in the source, nobody helps him, it's so loaded with meaning, isn't it? It speaks volumes about his isolation at that crucial juncture. Maybe his friends and family genuinely couldn't amass the kind of funds needed to plug a multi-billion-dollar hole. I mean, who could?
Right, that's a fair point.
Or perhaps the trust was already gone by then. Maybe they suspected the truth or were hearing rumors. Or maybe they themselves were reeling from the broader financial crisis and just didn't have liquid cash.
Could be any or all of those things.
Whatever the specific reason, the source presents this moment as one of complete abandonment, right when he was most in need of resources to potentially prop up the lie, even just for another day or two.
It really underscores how the relationships, maybe built at least partly on the foundation of the fraud, or the perception of his success, just crumbled instantly when the truth was exposed or even strongly suspected. When that supposed endless supply of money vanishes, so too does the network that was either benefiting from it or simply believed unquestionably in its existence.
Yeah.
This desperation signifies the shift from trying to somehow sustain the unsustainable to the inevitable confrontation that absolutely must follow.
And that confrontation, according to the source, is precisely what happens next. We move into a section titled, essentially, Facing the Family. This feels like it's going to be intense.
Yeah, this is clearly a pivotal sequence in the narrative presented by the source, starting with scene 16. It's placed in December 2008. His two sons, Mark and Andrew, who worked at the firm, though importantly on the legitimate market-making side, not the fraudulent investment advisory side, they meet him in his office.
And the source describes a seemingly simple yet incredibly pointed question they ask him. In the midst of all this unfolding financial chaos, with redemption requests mounting like crazy, and knowing, presumably, that the firm was under severe pressure, they ask him something specific about bonuses.
Yeah, the source quotes their question as, "Dad, if there's no money, where are you giving bonuses from?"
Oof, that question's like a laser, isn't it? Just cutting straight through the fog of pretense.
Totally, because why on earth would you be paying out bonuses, which implies success and available cash, in a legitimate business that's facing existential redemption demands and is supposedly strapped for cash? Makes absolutely no sense.
It strongly implies an artificial source of funds, doesn't it? Which is exactly what a Ponzi scheme uses to maintain appearances. The source doesn't detail why they specifically asked about bonuses at that moment, but it suggests they saw something profoundly inconsistent, something that just didn't add up, and they couldn't reconcile it with a normal business facing a downturn.
It's a classic case of a seemingly small detail exposing the giant lie, right? Giving out bonuses when you're supposedly illiquid is just a massive red flag. And the source notes Bernie's reaction to this direct challenge from his sons.
What was it?
He is silent.
Just silent.
Yeah. According to the source, that silence is incredibly telling. He, the master manipulator, the architect of decades of intricate lies, has no answer for them. He can't conjure up a plausible excuse, not one that would satisfy that specific logical question in that critical moment.
It's the source's way of showing he was completely cornered, wasn't he? Exposed by his own son's simple observation of a basic financial inconsistency that pointed directly, unavoidably, to the fraud.
Exactly. And that profound silence, that feeling of being cornered in the office, it leads directly, according to the source, to scene 17, the confession at home. The source states that Bernie tells his family everything at his house. So this moves the confrontation from the professional space, the office, to the intensely personal space of their home.
This feels like the absolute emotional core of the narrative presented by the source. He doesn't just confess a business failure. He confesses the totality, the entirety of the deception that had defined his life, and by extension, their lives too.
And the source quotes his words directly. The language is just stark and absolutely devastating. "I was running a Ponzi scheme. Everything was a lie. We are completely finished."
Everything was a lie. Like, absorb the weight of that sentence for a moment. It wasn't just the investment returns that were fake. It was the reputation, the success, the family standing in the community, their very identity, all meticulously built on this fundamental, massive lie.
And the source describes the family's reaction to this bombshell confession. Predictably, they are in shock.
Completely understandable shock.
And it specifies further. The sons start crying.
Oh, man.
Yeah. This detail, the son's tears, it just adds another layer to the emotional devastation. It wasn't just financial ruin they were confronting in that moment, but the profound betrayal by their own father, the destruction of their family name, and the complete shattering of their reality, their understanding of their entire lives up to that point. The source really emphasizes this intensely emotional fallout within the most private sphere.
The shock and the tears. They just underscore the personal catastrophe this confession represented for them. Their lives, their futures, their understanding of who their father was, all irrevocably altered in that single instant. It's the source's way of showing the immediate, crushing human impact of the lie on his own inner circle.
And the source follows this incredibly emotional confession with what has to be a profoundly dramatic and difficult decision in scene 18. The sons, Mark and Andrew, they make a choice. And according to the source, they decide to expose Bernie.
Wow, immediately.
That's how the source presents it, as a critical, immediate turning point right after the confession. They are told the truth, the whole awful truth, and their response isn't to try and help him hide it or find some way out or attempt to cover it up. According to the source, their immediate decision is to inform the authorities.
That is remarkable. The source details their swift actions following the confession. They call their lawyer first, presumably for advice on how to proceed, and then they inform the authorities. It's presented as a direct, almost instantaneous consequence of understanding the sheer magnitude of the lie they'd just been told.
This must have been just an agonizing moral dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Turning in your own parent. The source presents it almost as a matter-of-fact decision made right after the confession.
Yeah, it strongly suggests that the scope of the deception, the sheer scale of the ruin that was about to unfold for thousands of people, was just so immense, so overwhelming, that the option of protecting their father simply wasn't something they could or would pursue in that moment.
The potential harm to countless others, charities, families, retirees,
Yeah.
and maybe also the realization of the total, absolute betrayal they felt personally. It must have outweighed the filial bond.
It truly forces you to contemplate the unbearable weight placed upon them in that instant. The lie wasn't some abstract financial maneuver anymore. It was about thousands upon thousands of lives, people's life savings, their futures, all built on sand. And their decision, as presented by the source, immediately set in motion the legal consequences that form the basis of the next section.
Right, which brings us to a section titled, very fittingly, The Deception Unmasked.
Okay. So scene 19 details the incredibly swift consequence of the sons reporting the scheme. The source states that the very next day, the FBI arrives at Bernie's house. So the dominoes started falling incredibly rapidly once the truth was out and officially reported.
That speed is quite remarkable, isn't it? Once the authorities were informed by the sons, there was apparently no delay. And the source gives us a specific line from the FBI agent who confronted Madoff in his home, presumably his Manhattan penthouse.
What did the agent say?
The agent asks him, according to the source, is there any innocent explanation? It's framed almost like giving him one last opportunity, perhaps, to offer any kind of legitimate explanation for the financial discrepancies they were about to uncover, however unlikely that might seem.
A final chance, maybe procedural, maybe just human, to provide a non-criminal reason for what was happening. But the source states that Bernie's answer is immediate, direct, and completely without any attempt at obfuscation.
What does he say?
He responds, "No innocent explanation. I was running a massive Ponzi scheme."
Just like that. Wow.
As like that. That direct, clear confession to the FBI, as presented in the source, is really striking. After decades, literally decades, of building and meticulously maintaining this incredibly elaborate facade, in the moment of being caught red-handed, he immediately admits everything. There's no denial, no attempt to lie his way out of it.
Why do you think that was?
Well, perhaps he just saw the utter futility of it all. He knew the game was irrevocably over the moment his sons reported him. He knew the proof would be undeniable once they started digging even slightly. Maybe it was even a kind of relief.
It certainly aligns with the previous scene described by the source, where he confessed to his family that everything was a lie. It suggests that once that internal dam broke, there was just no longer any energy or maybe even the will left to maintain the illusion when confronted externally by law enforcement. The fight was gone.
Seems plausible. Okay, so scene 20 then vividly describes the immediate public reaction to Bernie's arrest. The source emphasizes the sheer scale of the reaction, noting a massive media uproar. It became instant global news. Biggest financial fraud in history, right?
Absolutely. And the reaction on Wall Street, the place where he built his reputation, served as NASDAQ chairman, and operated for decades, it's described with similar intensity. Everyone was in shock, utter shock.
This shock wasn't just about, oh, another large fraud. It was about who it was. Madoff was this respected, almost revered figure in certain circles of the financial world, a pillar of the community, seemingly.
Right, and the source captures the common question being asked everywhere in the aftermath. Such a big fraud, how is it possible?
That question gets right to the heart of it, doesn't it? It reflects the incredible level of trust Madoff had painstakingly cultivated over all those decades. His perceived legitimacy, his connections, the regulatory blind spots that obviously existed, the unquestioning faith of so many sophisticated investors.
In charities and foundations.
Right. All of it contributed to making the sheer scale of the fraud seem unbelievable, almost impossible, to those outside the scheme looking in. It starkly reviews how deeply trust, even if it turns out to be tragically misplaced, is woven into the very fabric of the financial system, and how vulnerable that system can be.
Absolutely. So scene 21 brings us to the formal legal outcome of his confession and arrest. The source states that Bernie pleads guilty in court. He chose not to fight the charges, not to go through a lengthy trial.
Which makes sense given his confession. A trial would have just prolonged the agony and likely exposed even more damaging details, potentially implicating others further.
True. He admitted his guilt formally in a court of law, and the consequence, as the source notes, was exceptionally severe, clearly reflecting the unprecedented scale of the crime. The judge sentences him to 150 years in jail.
A sentence explicitly designed to ensure he would spend the rest of his natural life incarcerated. It was a powerful, unambiguous statement from the judiciary about the gravity of his crime and the utter devastation it wrought on so many lives.
And the source, importantly, doesn't just focus on Madoff's fate here. It explicitly reminds us again of the broader, shattering consequences for others. It says, his family is shattered.
Which we know tragically played out in the years that followed.
Yes, and investors' lives are ruined.
It's crucial that the source keeps reiterating that devastating human cost, beyond just the perpetrator. It highlights the disintegration of his immediate family structure, which was profound, and the total destruction of the financial security and life plans for thousands upon thousands of victims. These were direct results of his actions.
And the source concludes this section by stating Madoff's ultimate fate as decreed by that sentence. He spends his life in jail.
Which transitions us neatly, if grimly, into the final section of the source material we're looking at. This part describes the reality of that fate, and it's titled something like The End Result, Life and Impact in Jail.
Okay. Scene 22 immediately places us in his new, stark reality. Madoff is sent to the Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina to begin serving that 150-year sentence.
And the source describes a really profound transformation in his status and identity within that environment. It states that there, Bernie becomes an ordinary prisoner, just another inmate.
And the contrast with his former life is presented in the most direct terms imaginable by the source. Formerly referred to as Wall Street's king, he is now simply a number.
Just a number. That phrase, it just strips away everything, doesn't it? All the pretense, the power, the influence, the carefully constructed image he maintained for decades. He's reduced to the most basic, anonymous unit within the federal prison system. It's a potent, symbolic description of his fall from immense power and status to utter anonymity within the confines of incarceration.
And scene 23 provides really concrete, almost mundane details about this ordinary prison life, which makes the fall even more stark.
Oh.
The source says Bernie does small jobs, like cleaning and chapel duty.
Wow. Just think about that contrast for a moment. Cleaning floors or helping out with duties in a prison chapel compared to orchestrating billion-dollar trades, hobnobbing with the elite, and living a life of unimaginable luxury and privilege.
It's hard to even picture. And the source drives this point home further by detailing his earnings for this work. According to the source, he receives only 24 cents per hour.
24 cents an hour. After handling billions.
Yeah. And the result of that minimal wage is also detailed. His savings, his commissary account presumably, are limited to only a few $100s.
This level of specific detail, the 24 cents an hour, the few $100s in savings, it's incredibly effective in emphasizing the complete, absolute reversal of his financial state. It puts a tangible, almost pathetic number on the end of his wealth. The source explicitly states the outcome. The luxury life is completely over. Kaput.
These granular details, the cleaning duties, the tiny wage, the small savings, they make the abstract idea of life in prison incredibly tangible, don't they? They underscore the total dismantling of his former life of immense wealth and extravagance. It's a really stark picture painted by the source.
Moving to scene 24, the source addresses his health and his attempts, maybe desperate attempts, to alter his fate while incarcerated. It notes that Bernie's health deteriorates significantly over time in prison.
And it lists specific health problems that affected him. Kidney disease, serious heart problems, and other issues linked, the source suggests, to stress. It mentions he often stays in the prison hospital ward, indicating a significant decline in ongoing, serious medical issues.
Yeah, it suggests the physical toll that, well, maybe decades of fraud, the immense stress of maintaining that lie, the collapse itself, and then the reality of long-term imprisonment took on his body. It all caught up with him physically.
Seems likely. The source also notes that despite the life sentence and his failing health, he did attempt to regain his freedom late in life. He appealed for early release, often called compassionate release.
An attempt, perhaps based on those compassionate grounds given his terminal kidney disease, to escape the judgment of spending his entire life in jail. But the source states the judge refused, unequivocally.
And the judge's quoted response, as presented in the source, powerfully reinforces the finality and the original intent of that 150-year punishment. The judge basically said, "My intention is that he remain in jail for life."
That judicial statement is absolutely uncompromising, isn't it? It shut the door firmly on any hope of release, emphasizing that the severity of his crime, in the court's eyes, warranted punishment right up until his death. It reinforces the permanence of his sentence, as described earlier, no escaping the consequences.
Okay, so scene 25 presents what the source frames as a kind of surprising paradox about his life behind bars. It notes that despite being just a number institutionally, he is treated, by some inmates at least, like a celebrity.
Which is weird, right? It's a truly strange twist in his story. Even within the confines of Butner, his sheer notoriety made him stand out. The source even states that some inmates called him a rock star.
A rock star for orchestrating the largest financial fraud in history? What does that even mean within the prison ecosystem?
I know. It speaks to a certain kind of twisted recognition or infamy that can exist in that world, maybe, where the sheer scale of a crime, even a non-violent financial one like this, can sometimes command a perverse kind of respect or fascination among some. But the source immediately contrasts this external perception with his internal state.
Ah, okay. What does it say about that?
Exactly. It says that inside, despite any weird outward recognition he might have received, he remains in guilt and regret.
And that he feels lonely, deeply lonely.
Right. This internal description provides a really crucial counterpoint to that external celebrity status. The source suggests that any external fascination didn't alleviate his internal burden at all. Despite the odd recognition from some inmates, Madoff was, according to this account, profoundly weighed down by the guilt and the devastating consequences of his actions, leading to a deep sense of isolation.
It's a powerful juxtaposition presented by the source, the infamous external figure who some saw with this strange kind of awe, maybe, versus the internally suffering individual haunted by guilt and loneliness. It definitely adds a layer of psychological complexity to his final years, as portrayed here.
Yeah, it does. And then appropriately, scene 26 brings the narrative back to the victims. This is such a critical perspective that needs to remain central to understanding the full impact of his actions. The source reiterates starkly that victims' lives were ruined.
And it provides specific, heart-wrenching examples of this ruin, going beyond just the financial loss, as devastating as that was. Some lost their entire life savings, obviously, but the source also notes that some families broke apart as a direct result of the financial and emotional stress caused by the fraud.
That really highlights that the impact of Madoff's fraud was far, far more than just a line item on a balance sheet. It destroyed people's security, it eroded trust within families and entire communities, it shattered relationships built over lifetimes.
The source does mention the significant years-long efforts at recovering funds for the victims, spearheaded by the trustee Irving Picard. It notes the government recovered billions.
Which was a monumental undertaking, involving complex litigation and clawbacks from those who profited, even unknowingly. Billions were indeed recovered, aimed at providing some measure of restitution to those he harmed directly. However, the source is very careful to add a crucial, sobering caveat.
Which is?
Not everything was returned.
Yeah, that's a critical point that must not be overlooked. Even with billions recovered, a historic recovery effort, actually the source acknowledges that complete restoration of what was truly lost.
Yeah.
Well, this wasn't possible.
How do you put a dollar figure on the years of lost security? The inability to retire as planned, the broken trust, the destroyed family bonds, the sheer trauma of realizing your financial life was built on a lie.
And you can't. The damage, as the source emphasizes, was often irreparable and extended far, far beyond the financial numbers, huge as they were.
And finally, scene 27 marks the definitive end of Bernie Madoff's story as presented in the source. It states plainly that he dies in jail, specifically at the Butner Medical Center, from kidney failure in April 2021.
So his life concludes in the very place the judge had intended him to remain until the end. And the source explicitly frames his life's end, his final fate, as becoming a lesson.
It spells out the lesson derived from his entire story, right from the initial deception through the dizzying heights, the catastrophic collapse, and the grim consequences. The end of greed and deception is always bad. Simple as that. It presents his life as a cautionary tale, culminating in this somber, inevitable end.
Which brings us directly to the final part of the source material, a concluding section titled simply, The Story's Message.
Right. Scene 28 presents the broader perspective that the narrator, or the source itself, draws from Madoff's life. It explicitly states that Bernie Madoff's story isn't just about one uniquely evil or flawed person.
Instead, the source argues it's a story that resonates much more broadly. It's about, well, maybe it's about all those who risk everything in the pursuit of getting rich quickly, those who are perhaps tempted by shortcuts or opportunities that just seem too good to be true.
It identifies the key intertwined themes that run through this entire narrative we've just explored scene by scene: trust, greed, and deception. It frames Madoff's life as a journey utterly defined by these powerful, often destructive forces.
And the final overarching takeaway, according to the source, is that this entire journey, the spectacular rise built purely on lies, the inevitable and devastating collapse, the severe consequences for everyone involved, the isolated end this whole saga is a lesson for everyone.
It attempts to move the narrative beyond just a single, albeit massive, criminal case, and frames it as a kind of universal cautionary tale, a tale about fundamental human vulnerabilities, like the allure of easy money, the corrupting influence of unchecked greed, and the inevitable destructive consequences of building any kind of success on a foundation of deception. It's presented as a direct warning about the dangers of sacrificing integrity for that allure of quick, effortless wealth.
So, guided by the specific details and these scenes presented in the source excerpts we've looked at, we've taken a pretty deep dive into the final desperate moments of Bernie Madoff's scheme as the 2008 financial crisis hit, haven't we?
Yeah, we covered the shocking confession that finally laid bare the decades of lies, the immediate public and legal fallout that followed so swiftly, the severe and long-lasting consequences for both his family and, crucially, the thousands of victims.
And finally, the isolated, somber reality of his life and eventual death in prison.
We've definitely explored the crushing weight of deception as it apparently became unbearable for him, the devastating impact it had far beyond just Madoff himself, touching countless lives in profound ways, and the ultimate futility and emptiness of a life and fortune built entirely on lies, at least as this narrative presents it.
And drawing on that clear, explicit message presented right at the end of the source about the dangers of pursuing quick wealth through questionable means, and the emphasis throughout on trust, greed, and deception in this incredibly detailed account of Bernie Madoff's downfall, it makes you wonder, what does this story ultimately tell us about the nature of trust itself? Especially in our financial systems, but maybe more broadly too.
That's a huge question.
It is. And how do we, just as individuals navigating a complex world full of opportunities, some real, some maybe not, how do we evaluate things that seem almost too good to be true? And what does true success really mean when we see the devastating outcome of building a life's work on such a monumental lie?
Yeah, and maybe how do we discern authenticity from sophisticated deception? And what responsibility do we have, maybe not just for ourselves, but for our communities, to question things that just don't seem to add up?
Those are the enduring, difficult questions that this story, presented through these specific details from the source, really compels us to confront, aren't they?
They certainly are. A lot to think about there.
Indeed. And definitely something worth reflecting on long after we finish this deep dive. Thank you for joining us.